But back to this coronavirus fiasco, and that is what it is. I see a pub in Sydney owned by Craig Laundy has been fined $10,000 for having a birthday lunch for his son. Fines hoisted around left, right and centre. But I think governments are nervous because it's emerging that politicians have done more damage than the virus. Remember, kids were banned from schooling. The Constitution's been ripped up. State borders have become barriers. The federal government complains, but they won't allow anyone to leave their own country. As my colleague Chris Kenny said splendidly, quote, "We lost twice as many people from the flu last year than we have lost so far from the pandemic." And overall deaths in Victoria in July were down 500 on July last year. But the economy's been smashed. Melburnians are locked up. They can't leave their house at night. It's martial law. Restrictions everywhere with no epidemiological justification. You walk into a shop all over the country or your workplace. It tells you where to stand, where you can't stand, where you can queue. And they've persisted with this alarmist talk for 6 months that we're all at risk. It is blatant dishonesty. Today, across Australia, apart from Victoria, 12 people in hospital, 7 in intensive care. That's across Australia. And yet there's talk that entire cities could be declared hotspots. The Prime Minister says he wants a definition of a hotspot, not the issue, PM. The issue is the absurd response to this virus. Qantas has just tossed out 6,000 people out of work. The answer to every problem seems to be tip in more borrowed money. But don't worry, Daniel Andrews says he'll be leading Labor to the next election. I don't think so. It's clear that governments listen to the advice that suits them. I've mentioned before the Lancet Medical Journal, which recently published, and I repeat again, quote, "In our analysis, full lockdowns and COVID-19 testing were not associated with reductions in the number of critical cases or overall mortality," unquote. I've mentioned before that in the Spanish flu, authorities didn't close down whole societies and economies in 1918. The state didn't enter homes to tell people how to live, who and how many to meet, when, where and what they could shop for and which businesses could operate and under which conditions. The death toll in Australia from coronavirus is 517, but 430 are in Victoria, 52 in New South Wales. Do your maths. Almost 8 months, 35 deaths in the rest of Australia. But people are imprisoned. They have no voice. They can't leave their state or their country. Businesses are shut. The narrative is one of permanent fear. More than 18,000 Australians living abroad are trying to return home. They can't. And those on the front line of Victoria's hotel quarantine fiasco have told the inquiry into this Andrews farce that the hotel quarantining was shambolic, chaotic and not safe. The issue is, as I've been saying for weeks, quarantining, lockdowns and border closures. The Nobel Prize-winning scientist from Stanford University, Professor Michael Levitt, has argued lockdowns, his words, are a huge mistake. But then, have a look at this. Take the World Health Organization's own advice on pandemic and epidemics from October last year. Check the table. Note on the left, it's for pandemic. And it says, quote, in the black, not recommended in any circumstances. Look at the bottom 4. Contact tracing, quarantine of exposed individuals, entry and exit screening, border closures. Yet one government after another has introduced all of those measures in a damaging and cascading rush. I would argue we've suffered absurd, inconsistent and contradictory advice. Well, it might get even more difficult for Daniel Andrews. Because earlier this year, Daniel Andrews introduced frighteningly tough industrial manslaughter legislation with the aim of jailing the boards of top corporations should they be linked with deaths in the workplace. Ministers and public servants were excluded. Has Daniel Andrews and his government been responsible through a failure of quarantining and failures in aged care? Has the government been responsible for unsafe work practices that have contributed to death? Are they liable for prosecution? If not, why not? If the act was designed to attack large enterprises linked to workplace deaths, how else do you describe the failure of the Andrews government leading to deaths in the workplace? Ken Phillips is the Executive Director of Self-Employed Australia. He has written a letter to the Victorian Work Cover Authority containing the following sentence. Now, this is lethal. Quote, I consider that the development, planning, management and implementation of the Victorian Government COVID-19 Hotel Quarantine Containment Program, the planning phase of which commenced in late January or early February 2020, such time, he says, only specifically ascertainable by investigation, instigated, managed or controlled by the Victorian Government, various Victorian Government organisations and agencies, including their contractors and staff, constitutes several offences contrary to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, in that the health, safety and welfare of employees and other persons were put at risk, contrary to, but not limited to, sections 21, 23, 26 and 32 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Ken Phillips, the Executive Director of Self-Employed Australia, joins us tonight. Ken, thank you for your time. On the evidence we have, there was no proper training of the security guards at the quarantine hotels. There were other events that led to the deaths of many people because of the spread of the infection. Andrews played his left-wing anti-private sector card when he altered the Bracks legislation of 2004. Andrews' government, bowing to the unions, added industrial manslaughter clauses which allowed people not in control of risk to be convicted of industrial manslaughter and be liable to long jail sentences. Where does the Andrews government stand in the light of its own legislation?
Well, quite straightforward, Alan. They are liable. They are subject to prosecution. And the advice that I have from very senior occupational health and safety lawyers, given the evidence that we've seen from the current inquiry, is that prosecutions should occur. The WorkCover Authority in Victoria under the Act is required to proceed. We have the power under the Act to write to the authority requiring them to proceed. If they do not proceed, they must report to us why not. We can then request the Department of Prosecutions to prosecute, and we must be given reasons why if they do not. And so far, we have not received a reply to our letter. Just to
explain, Ken, to our viewers, I understand that any individual who believes there's been a breach of occupational health and safety law under that Act can write to WorkCover asking it to investigate to determine whether there should be a prosecution. If no prosecution, WorkCover must in writing tell the individual why there's no prosecution. The applicant can then ask for the matter to be referred to the DPP, and the DPP then must prosecute or give an answer why there's no prosecution. So, come back to you, Ken. As you read the Act, could there be prosecutions against the boards and managements of managers of aged care facilities?
Well, no question of that at all. That's what the Act provides for.
And if WorkCover finds no case against the Victorian Government, they're going to have to give reasons. So,
correct.
Andrews' industrial manslaughter clauses don't exempt public servants and ministers. So where do we go from here, Ken, very quickly?
There's a time lag of about 3 months. If they don't act, we will certainly be going to court to require them to act. And we've set up a fund to be able to pay for the court action. So we're not going to sit back and wait.
Good on you. Well, we'll keep in touch with you, Ken. It's very good to talk to you tonight. It's a very interesting development in Victoria. That's Ken Phillips, the Executive Director of Self-Employed Australia. Daniel Andrews is in trouble on all fronts, but it's clear that all governments have imposed quarantine and lockdown arrangements in defiance of world authorities. And while we must live with the consequences, I'm telling you something, so too must governments at the ballot box.